Welcome back to GCC Kids Connection, where we are connecting with each other while you're home from school. We're connecting with some really cool books, and most importantly, we're connecting with God's Word. We're so glad you're here.
Well, welcome back, kids. Last time, poor Wilbur got some really sad news, but his good friend Charlotte says she's not going to let them kill Wilbur. We'll see how she works that out. But today, we're going to begin with Chapter 8 that's called A Talk at Home. On Sunday morning, Mr. and Mrs. Arble and Fern were sitting at breakfast in the kitchen. Avery had finished and was upstairs looking for his slingshot. "Did you know that Uncle Homer's goslings have hatched?" asked Fern. "How many?" asked Mr. Arble. "7," replied Fern. "There were 8 eggs, but 1 egg didn't hatch, and the goose told Templeton that she didn't want it anymore, so he took it away." "The goose did what?" asked Mrs. Arble, gazing at her daughter with an odd, worried look. "Told Templeton that she didn't want the egg anymore," repeated Fern. "Who is Templeton?" asked Mrs. Arble. "Oh, he's the rat," replied Fern. "None of us like him much." "Who's us?" asked Mr. Arble. "Oh, everybody in the barn cellar. Wilbur and the sheep and the lambs and the goose and the gander and the goslings and Charlotte and me." "Charlotte?" asked Mrs. Arble. "Who's Charlotte?" "She's Wilbur's best friend. She's terribly clever." "What does she look like?" asked Mrs. Arble. "Well," said Fern thoughtfully, "she has 8 legs. All spiders do, I guess." "Charlotte is a spider?" asked Fern's mother. Fern nodded. "A big gray one. She has a web across the top of Wilbur's doorway. She catches flies and sucks their blood. Wilbur just adores her." "Does he really?" said Mrs. Arble rather vaguely. She was staring at Fern with a worried expression on her face. "Oh, yes, Wilbur adores Charlotte," said Fern. "Do you know what Charlotte said when the goslings hatched?" "I haven't the faintest idea," said Mr. Arble. "Tell us." "Well, when the first gosling stuck its little head out from under the goose, I was sitting on my stool in the corner and Charlotte was in her web. She made a speech. She said, 'I am sure that every one of us here in the barn cellar will be gratified to learn that after 4 weeks of unremitting effort and patience on the part of the goose, she now has something to show for it.' Don't you think that was a pleasant thing for her to say?" "Yes, I do," said Mrs. Arble. "Now, Fern, it's time that you get ready for Sunday school. And tell Avery to get ready. And this afternoon, you can tell me more about what goes on in Uncle Homer's barn. Aren't you spending an awful lot of time there? You go there almost every day, don't you?" "I like it there," replied Fern. She wiped her mouth and ran upstairs. After she had left the room, Mrs. Arble spoke in a low voice to her husband. "I worry about Fern," she said. "Did you hear the way she was rambling on about the animals pretending they could talk?" Mr. Arble chuckled. "Well, maybe they do talk," he said. "I've sometimes wondered. At any rate, don't worry about Fern. She's just got a lively imagination. Kids think they hear all sorts of things." "Just the same, I do worry about her," replied Mrs. Arble. "I think I shall ask Dr. Dorian about her the next time I see him. He loves Fern almost as much as we do, and I want him to know how oddly she's been acting about that pig and everything. I don't think it's normal. You know perfectly well animals don't talk." Mr. Arble grinned. "Maybe our ears just aren't as sharp as Fern's," he said. A spider's web is stronger than it looks. Although it's made of thin, delicate strands, a web is not easily broken. However, a web gets torn every day by the insects that fly into it. Charlotte liked to do her weaving during the late afternoon, and Fern liked to sit nearby and watch. One afternoon, she heard a most interesting conversation and witnessed a strange event. "You have awfully hairy legs, Charlotte," said Wilbur as the spider busily worked on her task. My legs are hairy for a good reason, replied Charlotte. Furthermore, each leg of mine has 7 sections. The coxa, the trochanter, the femur, the patella, the tibia, the metatarsus, and the tarsus. Wilbur sat bolt upright. You're kidding, he said. No, I'm not either. Say those names again. I didn't catch them the first time. Coxa, trochanter, femur, patella, tibia, metatarsus, and tarsus. Goodness, said Wilbur, looking down at his own chubby legs. I don't think my legs have 7 sections. Well, said Charlotte, you and I lead very different lives. You don't have to spin a web. That takes real legwork. Well, I could spin a web if I tried, said Wilbur, boasting. I've just never tried. Let's see you do it, said Charlotte. Fern chuckled softly and her eyes grew wide with love for her pig. Okay, said Wilbur. You coach me and I'll spin one. It must be a lot of fun to spin a web. How do you get started? Take a deep breath, said Charlotte, smiling, and Wilbur breathed in deeply. Now climb to the highest place you can get to, like this. And Charlotte raced up to the top of the doorway. Wilbur scampered to the top of the manure pile. Very good, said Charlotte. Now, make an attachment with your spinnerets, hurl yourself into space, and let out a drag line as you go. Wilbur hesitated for a moment, and then he jumped into the air. He glanced hastily behind him to see if there was a piece of rope following him to check his fall, but nothing seemed to be happening in his rear, and the next thing he knew, he landed with a thump and grunted. Charlotte laughed so hard that her web began to sway. What did I do wrong? Asked the pig when he recovered from his bump. Nothing, said Charlotte. It was a nice try. I think I'll try it again, said Wilbur cheerfully. I believe what I need is a little piece of string to hold me. The pig walked out into the yard. You there, Templeton, he called. The rat poked his head out from under the trough. Got a little piece of string I could borrow? Asked Wilbur. I need to spin a web. Yes, indeed, said Templeton, who saved string. No trouble at all. Anything to oblige. He crept down into his hole, pushed the goose egg out of the way, and returned with an old piece of dirty white string. Wilbur examined it. Ah, that's just the thing, he said. Tie one end to my tail, will you, Templeton? Wilbur crouched low with his thin curly tail toward the rat. Wilbur seized the string, passed it around the end of the pig's tail, and had tied 2 half hitches. Charlotte watched with delight. Like Fern, she was truly fond of Wilbur, whose smelly pen and stale food attracted flies that she needed, and she was proud to see that he was not a quitter and was willing to try again. While the rat and the spider and the little girl watched, Wilbur climbed again to the top of the manure pile, full of energy and hope. Everybody watch, he cried. He summoned all his strength, threw himself into the air head first. The string trailed along behind him. But as he had neglected to fasten the other end of the string to anything, it really didn't do any good, and Wilbur landed with a thud, crushed and hurt. Tears came to his eyes. Templeton grinned, and Charlotte just sat quietly. After a bit, she spoke. You can't spin a web, Wilbur, and I advise you to put the idea out of your mind. You lack 2 things needed for spinning a web. What are they? Asked Wilbur sadly. You lack a set of spinnerets, and you lack the know-how. But cheer up! You don't need a web. Zuckerman supplies you with 3 big meals a day. Why should you worry about trapping food? Wilbur sighed. Oh, you're ever so much cleverer and brighter than I am, Charlotte. I guess I was just trying to show off. Serves me right. Templeton untied his string and took it back to his home. Charlotte returned to her weaving. You needn't feel too badly, Wilbur, she said. Not many creatures can spin webs. Even men aren't as good as spiders, although they think they're pretty good, and they'll try anything. Did you ever hear of the Queensboro Bridge? Wilbur shook his head. Is it a web? Sort of, replied Charlotte. But do you know how long it took men to build it? 8 whole years. My goodness, I would have starved to death waiting that long. I can make a web in a single afternoon. What do people catch on the Queensboro Bridge? Bugs? Asked Wilbur. No, said Charlotte. They don't catch anything. They just keep trotting back and forth across the bridge, thinking that there's something better on the other side. If they'd hang their heads down from the top of the thing and wait quietly, maybe they would get a good idea or something good would come along. But no, with men it's just rush, rush, rush every minute. I'm glad I'm a sedentary spider. What does sedentary mean? Asked Wilbur. Means I sit still a good part of the time and don't go wandering all over creation. I know a good thing when I see it, and my web is a good thing. I stay put and wait for what comes. Gives me a chance to think. Well, I'm sort of sedentary myself, I guess, said the pig. I have to hang around here whether I want to or not. You know where I'd really like to be this evening? Where? In a forest, looking for butternuts and truffles and delectable roots, pushing leaves aside with my wonderful, strong nose, searching and sniffing along the ground, smelling, smelling, smelling. You smell just the way you are, remarked a lamb who had heard them talking. You smell, I can smell you from here. You're the smelliest creature in this place. Wilbur hung his head and his eyes grew wet with tears. Charlotte noticed his embarrassment, and she spoke sharply to the lamb. You let Wilbur alone, she said. He has a perfect right to smell, considering his surroundings. You're no bundle of sweet peas yourself, and furthermore, you are interrupting a very pleasant conversation. What were we talking about, Wilbur, when we were so rudely interrupted? Oh, I don't remember, said Wilbur. It doesn't make any difference. Let's not talk any more for a while, Charlotte. I'm getting sleepy. You go ahead and finish fixing your web, and I'll just lie here and watch you. It's a lovely evening. So Wilbur stretched out on his side. Twilight settled over Zuckerman's barn and a feeling of peace. Fern knew it was almost supper time, but she just couldn't bear to leave. Swallows passed in silent wings in and out of the doorway, bringing food to their young ones. From across the road, a bird sang, "Whip-poor-will, whip-poor-will." Lurvy sat down under the apple tree and lit his pipe. The animal sniffed the familiar smell of strong tobacco. Wilbur heard the trill in the trees and an occasional slamming of the kitchen door. All these sounds made him feel comfortable and happy, for he loved life and he loved being part of the world on a summer evening. But as he lay there, he remembered what the old sheep had told him. The thought of death came to him, and he began to tremble with fear. "Charlotte," he said softly. "Yes, Wilbur?" "I don't want to die." "Of course you don't," said Charlotte in a comforting voice. "I just love it here in the barn," said Wilbur. "I love everything about this place." "Of course you do," said Charlotte. "We all do." The goose appeared, followed by her 7 goslings. They thrust their little necks out and kept up their musical whistling like a tiny troop of pipers. Wilbur listened to the sound with love in his heart. "Charlotte," he said. "Yes," said the spider. "Were you serious when you promised you would keep them from killing me?" "I was never more serious in my life. I am not going to let you die, Wilbur." "How are you going to save me?" asked Wilbur, whose curiosity was very strong at this point. "Well," said Charlotte vaguely, "I don't really know, but I'm working on a plan." "That's wonderful," said Wilbur. "How is the plan coming, Charlotte? Have you got very far with it? Is it coming along pretty well?" Wilbur was trembling again, but Charlotte was cool and collected. "Oh, it's coming all right," she said lightly. "The plan is still in the early stages and hasn't completely shaped up yet, but I'm working on it." When do you work on it? Asked Wilbur. When I'm hanging upside down at the top of my web, that's when I do my thinking, because all the blood runs to my head. I'd be glad to help in any way I can. Oh, I like working alone, said Charlotte. I can think better when I think alone. All right, said Wilbur, but don't fail to let me know if there's anything I can do to help, no matter how slight. Well, replied Charlotte, you must try to build yourself up. I want you to get plenty of sleep and stop worrying. Never hurry, never worry. Chew your food thoroughly and eat every bite of it, except you must leave a little bit for Templeton. Gain weight and stay well. That's the way you can help. Keep fit and don't lose your nerve. Do you think you understand? I understand, said Wilbur. Go along to bed then, said Charlotte. Sleep is important. Wilbur trotted over to the darkest corner of the pen and threw himself down. He closed his eyes, and in another minute he spoke. Charlotte, he said. Yes, Wilbur. May I go out to my trough and see if I left any of my supper? I think I might have left just a little bit of mashed potato. Very well, said Charlotte, but I want you in bed without delay. Wilbur started to race out the yard. Slowly, slowly, said Charlotte. Never hurry, never worry. Wilbur checked himself and crept slowly to his trough. He found a bit of potato, chewed it carefully, swallowed it, and walked back to his bed. He closed his eyes and was silent for a while. Charlotte, he said in a whisper. Yes? May I get a drink of milk? I think there are a few drops of milk left in my trough. No, the trough is dry, and I want you to go to sleep. No more talking. Close your eyes and go to sleep. Wilbur shut his eyes. Fern got up from her stool and started for home. Her mind was full of everything she had seen and heard. Good night, Charlotte, said Wilbur. Good night, Wilbur. There was a pause. Good night, Charlotte. Good night, Wilbur. Good night. Good night. Wilbur reminds me a little bit of kids when it's bedtime. Have you ever gone to bed and said, Mom, I need a drink? Well, Wilbur's sounding a little bit like that. Anyway, things are coming along. Charlotte's working on a plan to save Wilbur's life. Our activity sheet for today has Wilbur as our key character for today. What are some words you would use to describe Wilbur? And then it says, Fern's father said she has an active imagination. What do you like to imagine or pretend? And then there's another thinking question for you. And then down at the bottom, it says, God created Charlotte, the spider, with special legs that enable her to build a web. God created people with very special gifts as well. And so here are some Bible verses for you to look up that talk about the special gifts that God gives his people so that we can help to build up the body of Christ. So have fun with your activity sheet and join us back the next time to find out what's going to happen with Wilbur and his friends. See you next time.